General Hospital spoilers reveal that the moment Willow guided the car away from the Davis home, the warm glow of reunion still clinging faintly to Scout's coat and hair, something shifted in the air between them, subtle at first, almost too fragile to recognize, yet unmistakable for anyone who understood the language of fear. The holiday lights decorating the street passed by the windows in soft blurs, casting moving patterns across Scout's face. Patterns Willow noticed not with the sentimental delight she expected, but with an unfamiliar tightening in her chest. The child's silence was heavier than usual, her small hands clasped tightly in her lap, her breathing too shallow. Something had cracked open during their visit, something that had been building quietly for weeks, and its weight now filled the confined space of the car as though the truth itself were trying to materialize beside them. Willow kept her eyes on the road, but her attention was swallowed entirely by the quiet presence in the passenger seat. She could feel the tremors in Scout's composure before the girl ever spoke, could sense the unspoken confession pressing against the edges of containment, begging to be released. The shift in atmosphere was so jarring that Willow knew instinctively, absolutely, that Scout was finally preparing to reveal the truth she had been too frightened to articulate, and that truth, once spoken, would not only alter the dynamic between them but fracture the fragile understanding Willow had built around Drew's recent behavior. The deeper the car moved into the night, the more Scout's silence felt unnatural, less the quiet of a tired child, and more the silence of someone bracing for emotional impact. Willow sensed the tension growing like a slow, suffocating fog. Scout's gaze flickered toward the window, toward the passing streets, as though searching for something familiar to anchor herself. But the city around them, dressed in holiday cheer, only seemed to heighten her distress, emphasizing the gulf between the comfort of the Davis home and the dread that awaited her return to Drew. When the confession finally rose to the surface, it wasn't loud or dramatic. It came in the form of a trembling exhale, a shift in posture, a soft collapse of the shoulders that revealed more than any words could. Scout began speaking in broken fragments that Willow pieced together, with growing unease, fragments of fear, fragments of confusion, fragments of emotional pressure too heavy for someone her age to carry. She had felt threatened, not by danger in the physical sense, but by the volatility surrounding Drew, the unpredictable energy that had seeped into the way he moved, the way he spoke, the way he looked at her without truly seeing her. Scout revealed how Drew's changes had grown sharper with each passing week, how the warmth in him had retreated in ways she could not understand, how he felt distant even when he stood inches away, how she never knew whether her presence comforted him or burdened him, and how the uncertainty had begun to feel like a shadow she could not outrun. She described moments that struck Willow with chilling clarity, times when Drew seemed lost in his own mind, staring too long at nothing, reacting too strongly to simple things, closing himself off behind a wall Scout could not climb. Moments when she had felt small not because of her age, but because of the emotional storm swirling just beneath Drew's skin. As the confession deepened, Scout revealed something even darker, the specific moments when she felt she needed to hide, how she would retreat to her room and pretend to be asleep when Drew came home agitated, how she waited for signs of calm before approaching him, how she felt pressure building in him like something that might explode someday. She didn't accuse him of harm she didn't need to. The fear threaded into her voice was enough. She spoke not with resentment, but with the aching grief of a child watching someone she loved transform into someone she could no longer predict. Willow felt her pulse sharpen with each revelation, her grip on the steering wheel tightening until her knuckles whitened. She had suspected Drew was struggling, had sensed the fractures in him, but she had not understood the extent of the damage. She had not imagined that Scout, the one person Drew should have been protecting above all, had been silently absorbing the consequences of his unraveling. Willow felt anger rise, not at Drew himself, but of the invisible force that had twisted him into the shadow of the man he once was. Yet beneath the anger was something far more painful, the fear that Scout had been carrying this alone. The night grew heavier around them as Scout's confession continued to spill out in halting waves. She admitted that the moment she stepped into Alexis's home, she felt something she had been starving for: safety, connection, recognition, a sense of being seen again. She felt anchored, surrounded by voices that didn't tremble with unspoken tension, by women who held her with effortless warmth rather than strained attention. She admitted she wished she could stay longer. She admitted she wished she could stay permanently. And the moment those words left her, the car felt smaller, more fragile, as though the admission itself had cracked something sacred inside the little girl. For the first time, Scout revealed that she felt threatened not by cruelty, but by emotional instability. She lived in fear of causing Drew to spiral. She lived in fear of becoming the trigger for another one of his unpredictable shifts. She lived in fear of saying the wrong thing, of being too loud, too emotional, too honest. She lived in fear of becoming invisible in a home where Drew himself was slipping further into an emotional abyss. She felt as though she was fading into the background, as though her presence was becoming a burden he could no longer hold with steady hands. This was the new adjustment, the new storyline the writers were carefully threading. A slow, psychological unpeeling of the stability Drew once represented, replaced by uncertainty that radiated outward and settled onto Scout like an unwanted cloak. It was becoming clear that Scout's emotional safety was unraveling, that her instincts were sharper than adults realized, that she sensed danger not through violence but through atmosphere and atmosphere, that now clung to Drew like a second skin. Willow realized that Scout's confession was not simply a moment of vulnerability. It was a warning, a cry for help disguised as a child's quiet admission. Scout felt threatened because she sensed something in Drew that no one else had truly acknowledged, an instability that could grow into something catastrophic if left unchecked. Scout's fear was the first indicator of a deeper, darker shift, and Willow understood with chilling clarity that this was the beginning of a new arc, one that would expose the emotional fractures in Drew, the psychological toll of his recent choices, and the unintended damage he was inflicting on the little girl who had always looked at him with unwavering love. As Willow drove through the darkened roads of Port Charles, she felt a new responsibility settle onto her shoulders, heavy, unyielding, and absolute. Scout had chosen her as the one person she could trust, and that trust came with consequences. Willow knew she could no longer stand by and hope Drew would steady himself. Scout's fear had crossed into territory too dangerous to ignore. The adjustments in the storyline, the new tension forming around Drew, the unraveling of old relationships, all of it pointed toward an impending disaster. And in the center of it, trembling in the passenger seat, was the child who had unknowingly become the first witness to the downfall. Scout's confession marked the beginning of a new chapter, one driven not by external villains, but by internal collapse. A story of hidden fear, emotional instability, and the haunting possibility that something darker was brewing inside Drew. Willow felt it. Scout felt it. And the car, filled with silence and the weight of truth, carried them toward a future where the lines between safety and danger were beginning to blur. This was no longer a family issue. It was the birth of a crisis, and Scout had just revealed the first terrifying sign. The moment the car pulled farther and farther away from the Davis home, the fragile composure Scout had been clinging to began to fracture, revealing a vulnerability Willow had sensed but never imagined ran this deep. The soft afterglow of holiday warmth that had lingered on Scout's face only minutes earlier now faded like breath on glass, replaced by a haunting tension tightening around her small shoulders. Willow could feel it before Scout spoke. The silence was heavy, suffocating, thick with the weight of a truth too painful for a child to hold. As Scout's breathing grew uneven, Willow recognized that what was coming was not merely a confession, it was a plea, born from weeks of fear, confusion, and emotional isolation that had finally grown too large for her tiny heart to contain. Scout's composure collapsed in a slow, devastating unraveling. She began to tremble, not in a way that suggested physical cold, but in a way that revealed deep emotional exhaustion, the kind that builds silently in children who have been forced to navigate an environment far too unpredictable for their age. Her small hands hovered over the seatbelt, face angled toward the window, as though she was searching for a version of herself she had lost somewhere, between Drew's shifting moods and the comforting presence of the Davis family. And then, with the fragile courage of someone who had run out of places to hide, Scout let the truth slip into the space between them. She didn't want to go back. She didn't want the drive to end at Drew's home. She didn't want to return to the emotional instability that had become the air she breathed there. She wanted out. Not temporarily. Not for holidays. Not for weekends. She wanted freedom. Permanently. The words didn't come in neat, understandable statements. They came in broken emotional fragments, trembling breaths and sudden shivers. But Willow pieced them together with dawning horror. Scout was begging silently at first, then with a heartbreaking urgency for Willow to help her escape Drew's control. She didn't feel safe. She didn't feel heard. She didn't feel seen. She felt trapped in a house where she never knew which version of Drew she would face. When she walked into a room, and the one thing that had become painfully clear to her was that she could no longer pretend it was okay. Scout revealed that the warmth she experienced with Alexis, Christina, and Molly wasn't just pleasant, it was life-saving. She described the ease she felt in their home, the sense of belonging that wrapped around her like a blanket, the quiet steadiness of their love that contrasted sharply with the tension that now defined her life with Drew. She didn't simply enjoy being with the Davis women. She needed them. She longed for the emotional safety that came effortlessly from Alexis's gentle presence, for the laughter Christina carried into every room, for the quiet certainty Molly radiated even when she said nothing. With them, Scout felt protected. With them, she felt herself. The confession cut through Willow like a blade, not because of malice, But because of how deeply Scout believed every word she struggled to express, this was not a child throwing a tantrum or expressing temporary discomfort. This was a little girl recognizing, far earlier than she should have, that she was slipping into an emotional space too dark to endure alone. Her plea was not rooted in anger toward Drew but in the dawning understanding that his internal chaos had begun to spill outward into the walls of the home, into their shared moments, into the emotional oxygen she needed to survive. What Scout needed was stability, a rhythm she could trust, a sense of grounding that Drew no longer offered. Willow felt the shift instantly, the new adjustment in the narrative, the emotionally dangerous direction the story was beginning to take. Scout's desperation wasn't just a plot point, it was a signal, a warning, a revelation that Drew's deterioration had progressed far beyond what anyone had publicly acknowledged. Scout wasn't only scared for herself, she was scared of what her father might become, scared of the unpredictable storms that shadowed his movements, scared of the emotional pressure that built around him like a force field she couldn't break through. And in that fear, she saw her truth more clearly than any adult had, her real family. The one that made her feel anchored was the Davis family. For Scout, Alexis wasn't just a grandmother, she was a refuge. Christina wasn't just a fun aunt, she was a source of warmth. Molly wasn't just family, she was stability embodied. Together, they represented everything Scout had been losing at home: security, gentleness, predictability, unconditional acceptance. The more time Scout spent with them, the more unbearable it became to return to the tense, uncertain atmosphere Drew now carried with him like a shadow. As Scout's confession deepened, Willow felt the emotional landscape shifting beneath her. This wasn't simply a child's preference for one home over another. This was an emerging psychological crisis. Scout wasn't just unhappy, she was frightened. She wasn't just uncomfortable, she felt controlled. She wasn't just seeking connection, she was crying out for rescue, begging Willow to intercede before the emotional strain swallowed her completely. Scout wanted out so badly that she had begun imagining her life with the Davis family as her only path back to safety. She didn't feel she could say this to Drew, not without triggering something in him, not without fearing his reaction, not without risking more emotional instability than she could handle. Willow, listening to every trembling breath and every raw admission, felt the weight of responsibility crash down upon her. Scout's fear was no longer subtle, it was seeping through every word she struggled to form. Her voice carried the unmistakable tremor of a child who had been silently surviving chaos for far too long. And Willow understood immediately that Scout wasn't exaggerating. Children don't fabricate dread. They don't invent emotional danger. They don't beg to be saved unless their souls are quietly collapsing under the pressure. This was a new obsession forming within a storyline, not Scout's fear itself, but the consequences of that fear. Willow now stood between two emotional storms, the unraveling of Drew and the desperation of Scout. And as Scout clutched her seatbelt, shoulders trembling, Willow recognized that Scout's plea was more than a confession. It was the beginning of a transformation that would change the trajectory of all their lives. What Scout wanted was simple in words yet enormous in impact. She wanted to go home, not to Drew's house, but to the Davis house. She wanted her real family. She wanted safety. She wanted love that didn't crack under pressure. She wanted air that didn't taste like fear. She wanted her life back. And with those revelations, Willow finally understood. This wasn't just a storyline shifting. It was a warning of a darker upheaval approaching. A shift in power, in emotion, in danger. A new obsession growing at the edges of Drew's unraveling. And Scout, fragile, terrified, desperate, had just exposed the first fault line in a disaster waiting to break open. The moment Willow guided Scout back toward the Davis house, this time not for a brief holiday reunion, but for something far heavier. Something carved from fear and truth. She understood that the next steps would reshape the balance of the entire family. Scout's quiet plea in the car had changed everything. It had peeled back the last layer of silence, hiding the emotional damage she had been absorbing alone. Willow felt the weight of that responsibility pulling at her from every direction, urging her toward a decision she had not been prepared to make. Once she stepped through Alexis's door and confessed what had been happening, Scout's fear, her longing, her emotional suffocation, there would be no turning back. And yet, Willow also knew that silence now would be a form of complicity, a cruel betrayal of a child's trembling trust. The truth had to be spoken, and Alexis was the one person who needed to hear it. When Willow and Scout entered the Davis home again, the atmosphere changed instantly. Scout's shoulders loosened just enough for Willow to notice that subtle shift of a child stepping into a space that felt protective rather than precarious. The air seemed warmer, safer. But beneath that warmth, Willow felt a current of tension, unspoken yet waiting, as though the home itself sensed what was coming. Alexis approached with her usual grace, but Willow could see the faint flicker of concern in her eyes, a sixth sense honed over years of navigating crisis after crisis. She sensed immediately that Willow wasn't simply dropping Scout off. Something had ruptured. Something was wrong. And so it began the unraveling, the confession, the truth lay bare. Willow began using quiet, steady words, but Scout's emotions bled heavily through every moment. The little girl clung to Alexis with a desperation that no longer looked like affection but survival. Scout, trembling in her grandmother's arms, allowed the truth she had shared with Willow to spill out again in fragmented breaths. She didn't feel safe with Drew. She didn't understand him anymore. She felt watched, pressured, unsettled, trapped. She didn't feel like she had a home with him. She wanted to stay here with Alexis, with Christina, with Molly because this was where she felt she still belonged. Alexis listened, and with each detail Scout revealed, the calmness she maintained began to fracture beneath a storm of outrage, heartbreak, and fierce protective instinct. She held Scout tighter, not as a gesture of comfort alone, but as a silent vow forming in her bones. Willow watched that transformation with a mix of relief and dread, because she knew Alexis would not allow this truth to fade quietly into the noise of everyday family tension. Alexis was not the type to stand by while a child was slipping into emotional harm. She had fought too many battles, lost too many people, seen too many lives twisted by silence, and now Scout, her granddaughter, the child who embodied everything fragile but resilient, was pleading for escape. This moment became the first seismic shift in the storyline, a new adjustment rippling outward with consequences no one was prepared for. Alexis's protective instinct hardened into resolve. Willow saw the decision spark behind her eyes long before Alexis voiced it. She would fight. She would challenge Drew. She would go after custody if she had to. She would not allow Scout to return to a home filled with fear and instability. And this was not an impulsive reaction, it was a calculated, fierce response to a threat she recognized immediately. A threat she had witnessed in countless clients, countless victims, countless broken families. Drew was unraveling and Scout was being pulled down with him. Alexis would not let that continue. But with that decision came danger. The moment Alexis stepped into opposition against Drew, the emotional temperature of the storyline spiked. The situation was no longer about Scout's quiet dread or Willow's growing concern. It became a battle between two forces shaped by grief, trauma, and internal collapse. Drew, already spiraling emotionally, would not react rationally. Alexis knew this. Willow knew it. And yet the truth had been spoken, and once spoken, it could not be softened or withdrawn. The revelation had ignited something dark and uncontrollable. A new obsession began curling around the narrative, something that fed on Drew's instability and Alexis's determination. A new danger loomed, one that threatened to explode into something bigger than anyone anticipated. Willow felt the ground shifting beneath her, sensing the rise of a new fear, one no longer isolated to Scout's emotional distress, but now expanding to Drew's unpredictable reaction when he discovered what had been revealed. Drew, already haunted by internal storms, would feel threatened, exposed, cornered. And people who feel cornered do not retreat quietly. They lash out, they panic, they make mistakes. His unraveling, once subtle and private, would now accelerate in alarming ways. Alexis's involvement would force him to confront truths he had buried beneath layers of control and denial. But those truths would not surface gently, they would claw their way upward, dragging chaos with them. This marked the beginning of a dangerous escalation. Scout's confession had ignited a chain reaction that neither Willow nor Alexis could fully control. The psychological toll on Drew intensified. The shifts in his behavior would grow sharper, more volatile. Pulled taut by the idea that someone was trying to take his daughter away, the pressure twisting around him would become unbearable, turning his fear into obsession, his confusion into anger, his unraveling into something darker. And the story would lean into that darkness, pushing Drew toward the threshold of collapse. Alexis, now fully aware of what Scout had endured, stepped into the role of protector with an intensity that signaled trouble ahead. She began piecing together every sign, every subtle change, every moment that Scout had been too afraid to describe until now. The more she uncovered, the more determined she became, because in her eyes, this was not a simple custody dispute. It was a rescue mission. And Drew, in his current mental state, had become a danger not through violence, but through emotional instability that could snap at any moment. The threat was not physical, it was psychological, atmospheric. And with Scout being so sensitive to emotional shifts, the danger was magnified tenfold. As the tension escalated, a new layer of obsession grew within the narrative. Drew's internal struggle began to manifest outwardly, affecting his decisions, his movements, his reactions. His behavior, once merely concerning, became erratic. His judgment wavered. His sense of control deteriorated. He became paranoid, convinced that the world was conspiring against him when in truth, it was his own unraveling that had created the threat. But paranoia does not recognize itself. It sees enemies, traitors, saboteurs. And Drew, consumed by fear of losing Scout, would begin viewing Alexis and Willow not as family, not as support, but as threats to his authority, to his identity, to his crumbling stability. This signaled the beginning of one of the darkest turns in the storyline of psychological war. Wrapped in family ties, where the lines between protection and destruction blurred, Scout, the child caught at the center, had unknowingly triggered the rise of a dangerous new arc, the fall of Drew Kane. Willow, caught between compassion and fear, would be forced to confront truths she never wanted to face. Alexis, driven by maternal fury, would become the force challenging Drew's instability head-on. And Drew, spiraling deeper into emotional chaos, would be placed into a new category of danger, one he could not escape, one he did not understand, one he had created himself. This was the new obsession. This was the new danger. This was the new adjustment in the storyline. A battle for Scout's safety. And the beginning of Drew's descent into the darkest chapter of his life.